let me ask you something. What if the last domino was already falling? Venezuela, gone. Iran, dealt with. And now, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, a small island that has resisted, defied, and outlasted 12 American presidents is staring down the barrel of a 13th. Cuba. You've heard the name your whole life. Maybe it conjures old footage, missiles, cigars, a bearded man in military green, Cold War ghosts. But this isn't about ghosts anymore. This is about right now. About a president who looks at that island and doesn't see history. He sees an opportunity. About a Secretary of State who doesn't just see foreign policy, he sees something deeply personal. And about a people caught between a regime that is crumbling and a superpower that is circling. Before this video is over, you'll understand something most people miss entirely. This was never just about Cuba. There's a specific kind of frustration that builds over decades. Not the sharp kind. The kind that flares up and burns out fast. No, I'm talking about the slow kind. The kind that accumulates across administrations, across generations, across funerals of people who swore they'd live to see the day. For over 60 years, Cuba has been that frustration for the United States. 90 miles. That's the distance. You can almost see the lights on a clear night. And yet, for 6 decades, that stretch of water has felt like an ocean. Because everything the United States tried, Cuba absorbed. Sanctions. Cuba survived. Invasion. Cuba repelled it. Embargo. Cuba adapted. Isolation. Cuba found other friends. And here's what most people don't fully appreciate about that history. The United States didn't just fail once. It failed repeatedly, systematically, across every administration from Eisenhower to Biden. Democrat, Republican, hawk, dove, didn't matter. That island just wouldn't break. So let's go back to where this started. Because to understand what Trump wants today, you need to understand what the United States thought it was getting in 1959. When Fidel Castro rode into Havana, most Americans weren't afraid of him yet. Some even admired him. Here was this charismatic rebel who toppled a corrupt dictator. Fulgencio Batista was brutal, venal, and deeply in bed with American business interests. He ran Cuba like a private ATM for US corporations and organized crime figures. The mafia had casinos there. American companies owned vast plantations. The arrangement was profitable for Americans and for the tiny Cuban elite connected to them. Castro broke all of that. He seized the land, he nationalized the industries. He sent a very clear message to Washington. Cuba is not yours. The response was swift. The CIA trained a force of Cuban exiles and landed them at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. It was a disaster. Castro's forces crushed the invasion in less than 72 hours. And rather than weakening the revolution, the failed attack strengthened it. It gave Castro exactly the enemy he needed to consolidate power and justify everything that came next. Then came the embargo. The United States decided that if it couldn't break Cuba with force, it would break it with economics. Cut the island off, starve the regime of dollars, of trade, of the energy it needed to function. Wait for the system to collapse under its own weight. The theory made sense on paper, but Cuba did something the planners in Washington didn't fully account for. It found a lifeline. The Soviet Union stepped in, massively, generously. And for 30 years, Cuba traded its sugar, its soldiers, and its doctors for Soviet oil and economic support. The island became a Cold War chess piece, and for Moscow, keeping Cuba afloat was worth the investment. So the embargo bit, yes. Life in Cuba was hard, but the regime didn't fall, and then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And here, right here, is where the story gets genuinely human. Because when that lifeline disappeared, Cuba entered what Fidel himself called the special period. The economy contracted by 30% almost overnight. Calories dropped, blackouts became routine, people lost weight visibly, measurably. It was a genuine humanitarian catastrophe dressed up in revolutionary language. And still, the regime didn't fall. It adapted again. This time, Cuba traded something different: its doctors, its soldiers, its expertise. Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, became the new Soviet Union in miniature, sending oil to Havana in exchange for Cuban medical and military personnel. Cuba found other partners: China, Russia, Angola, Algeria, always another lifeline, always another reason for Washington to watch, wait, and grow more frustrated. That frustration is the backdrop for everything happening right now. Because Trump didn't arrive at this moment in a vacuum. He inherited 60 years of failed policy, a powerful and emotionally invested diaspora community in Florida, and, crucially, a Cuba that for the first time in decades has almost no lifelines left. Venezuela is gone, its leader captured by U.S. forces in January 2026. Iran dealt with in February. And the countries that used to quietly ship oil to Havana? One by one, they've stopped. The 30% tariff threat on any nation supplying oil to Cuba has done what 60 years of embargo couldn't fully accomplish. It's turned an economic siege into something approaching an actual blockade. Schools are closing, hospitals are canceling surgeries. Garbage trucks sit idle because there's no fuel to run them. Lines at gas stations stretch for hours. A country that needs 100,000 barrels of oil a day to function is receiving a fraction of that. Cuba is not just struggling. Cuba, right now, is on the edge of something it has never faced before. A collapse not of the economy alone, but of the basic infrastructure that holds daily life together. And in Washington, they know it. The question is, what do they plan to do with that knowledge? That's what we're going to unpack. Because the answer isn't as simple as regime change. It never is. There are layers here. Personal ones, political ones, historical ones that go all the way back to a small community in South Florida that has been waiting patiently, painfully, for decades. And right at the center of all of this, there's a name that matters more than most people realize. We'll get to him. But first, let's talk about what Trump actually wants, because it's not what you might think. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. When a president talks about foreign policy, the official language is always about national security, about democracy, about freedom and human rights and the rule of law. That's the vocabulary of statesmanship, and it sounds right coming out of a podium in front of flags. But underneath that language, always, in every administration, in every era, there are other calculations running, domestic ones. And with Trump and Cuba, those domestic calculations may be the most important piece of the entire puzzle. Let's be honest about something. Cuba is not Iran. It has no nuclear weapons program. It's not enriching uranium or funding proxy militias across 3 continents. Cuba is not a Venezuela either. It doesn't sit on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. In purely strategic terms, Cuba is a small, economically devastated island with an aging military and a government that can barely keep the lights on. So why does it feel like a priority? Why is the Pentagon drawing up military options? Why is there a State Department delegation flying into Havana for the first time in years? Why does Trump keep bringing it up, publicly, repeatedly, almost eagerly? The answer begins in Miami, specifically It begins with a community that has shaped American politics more than almost any other diaspora group in modern history. Cuban Americans in South Florida are not just voters. They are a force. They are organized, passionate, financially influential, and this is the part that matters most right now, emotionally invested in a way that transcends normal political calculation. These are people, or the children and grandchildren of people, who left everything, who crossed the Florida Straits on rafts and in makeshift boats, who arrived with nothing and built lives from scratch, who watched for decades as the government that took their homes and imprisoned their relatives and dismantled their world simply refused to fall. A Miami Herald poll published in April found that 79% of Cuban Americans in South Florida support some form of U.S. military intervention in Cuba. Read that number again, 79%. That is not a political preference. That is a generational wound voting. And Trump, whatever you think of him as a leader or as a person, is extraordinarily skilled at reading that kind of energy. He understands that this community doesn't want diplomacy. They've watched diplomacy fail. They don't want another round of negotiations that produce nothing. They want resolution. They want the story to end. And midterm elections are in November. That's not a cynical observation. It's just the reality of American politics. Every move a president makes in the second term gets filtered through what it means for the party's position in Congress. Florida is a critical state. The Cuban-American vote in South Florida is a critical block. A visible win on Cuba, any kind of win, would carry enormous political weight heading into those midterms. So when Trump says, and I'm quoting here, "We could very well end up having a friendly takeover of Cuba," what he's describing isn't just foreign policy. It's a domestic narrative, a story he can tell at rallies, a victory he can point to. But here's where it gets complicated. Because a friendly takeover, whatever that means in practice, requires something on the other side. It requires a Cuba that's willing to make concessions, and those concessions have a price tag attached to them. The U.S. delegation that flew into Havana in April brought a list of demands. Compensation for American citizens and corporations whose assets were seized after the 1959 revolution, a figure that some estimates put between $9 and $10 billion. The release of political prisoners, greater political freedoms, and implicitly, some kind of transition away from the current government. Now, think about that from Havana's perspective for a moment. Cuba's economy is in free fall. The government can't pay its civil servants properly. Hospitals are running out of medicine, and Washington is asking for $10 billion? That's not a negotiation opening. That's a surrender demand dressed in diplomatic language. And yet, Cuba has already started moving. In March, new regulations were introduced, allowing Cubans living abroad to own businesses on the island. In April, 2,000 political prisoners were released. These are not small gestures, especially for a government that has spent 60 years treating any concession as an existential threat. The regime is reading the room. They know the situation is different this time. They know the lifelines are gone. They know the oil isn't coming. So they're trying to find the minimum concession that buys them survival. And Trump, or more precisely, the people around Trump, are trying to figure out whether any concession Cuba makes is actually enough to change anything real. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in Washington wants to say out loud. Removing Diaz-Canel doesn't change Cuba. Diaz-Canel is not the power, he's the face. The actual center of gravity in the Cuban system is a 94-year-old man who is technically retired, Raúl Castro, Fidel's brother, who still commands the loyalty of the military and controls GISA, the state conglomerate that runs Cuba's economy. Hotels, financial companies, import operations, all of it flows through GISA. And GISA answers to the military, and the military answers to Raúl. So even if there's a deal, even if Díaz-Canel steps aside, even if some reform-minded figure takes his place, if Raúl Castro is still breathing and still connected, the architecture of the Cuban system doesn't change. And there's a legal dimension to this that matters enormously. The Helms-Burton Act, signed by Bill Clinton in the 90s, ties the removal of the U.S. embargo to very specific conditions. One of them is that the transition government in Cuba cannot include Raúl Castro, not as a figurehead, not in any capacity. Which means that even if Trump cuts a deal with Havana, Congress may not be able to lift the embargo, which means ordinary Cubans, the ones standing in those gas lines, the ones whose kids are missing school, the ones rationing medicine, may see nothing change in their daily lives, even if their government signs an agreement on paper. That's the trap. And it's been there, quietly, for 30 years, built into the law, a mechanism designed to prevent a soft landing for the Cuban regime, but one that may also prevent any landing at all. So Trump wants a win. Cuba needs relief. But the architecture of the situation makes a clean resolution almost mathematically impossible. Unless someone can navigate all of it, the law, the diaspora, the Cuban military, Raúl Castro, the political prisoners, the compensation claims, and the election calendar, simultaneously. And that brings us to the person who may be the most important figure in this entire story. A man who grew up hearing about Cuba at a kitchen table in a small house in Miami, whose parents came with nothing, who built a political career on the promise that one day, things would be different. His name is Marco Rubio, and his role in all of this is far more complicated than most people understand. There's a particular kind of politics that doesn't come from ambition alone. It comes from something older. Something that was handed down at a dinner table, carried in apparent silence, felt in the space between what was said and what was never spoken. Marco Rubio didn't choose to care about Cuba the way a senator chooses a committee assignment. He inherited it. And that inheritance, more than any policy brief, more than any strategic calculation, is what's driving the most consequential piece of American foreign policy toward the Caribbean right now. His parents left Cuba before the revolution fully consolidated. They came to Miami with almost nothing. They built a life. They watched from 90 miles away as the country they came from became something unrecognizable. They watched it become a symbol, a wound, a cause, and Rubio grew up inside that wound. When Barack Obama announced the normalization of relations with Cuba in 2014, most of Washington saw a pragmatic opening, a chance to try something different after 50 years of failure. There was genuine optimism in that moment, the idea that engagement might accomplish what isolation never could. Rubio didn't see it that way. He saw betrayal, not just political disagreement, something that felt personal to him in a way that's hard to fully explain unless you've grown up in a community where Cuba isn't a foreign policy topic, but a family story. He called it a joke. He said the U.S. was reaching out to develop friendly relationships with serial human rights violators. And he meant every word. That reaction wasn't theater, it was reflex. And now, in an almost poetic turn of history, Rubio sits at the center of American foreign policy as Secretary of State, the son of Cuban immigrants, the man who spent his entire political career arguing for a harder line against Havana, is now the person holding the file. Think about what that means for a moment, because Rubio's position is genuinely unusual. He's not just a hawk, He's not just someone ideologically opposed to the Cuban government. He's someone who has spent decades thinking about this problem, obsessively, personally, from multiple angles, and who has arrived at a position that is, in some ways, more nuanced than his public rhetoric suggests. He has hinted, carefully, in measured language, that change in Cuba doesn't have to happen all at once, that everyone is mature and realistic, that there might be a path that introduces reforms gradually while keeping much of the existing structure intact during a transition. That is not the language of regime change maximalism. That is the language of someone who has actually thought about what happens the morning after. And that matters enormously, because the history of American-backed regime changes in the region is not a confidence-inspiring one. Iraq, Libya. The aftermath of those interventions haunts every conversation about what comes next in Cuba. You can remove a government, but you cannot install a functioning society from the outside. Rubio knows this, which is why his approach, if there is a coherent approach, seems to be something different. Not a dramatic toppling, not a Bay of Pigs replay, but a managed transition, a negotiated transformation, something that changes enough to satisfy the Cuban-American community and the political requirements of Congress, while leaving enough of the existing apparatus in place to prevent collapse. It's an extraordinarily difficult needle to thread. Because on one side, you have Cuban exiles and anti-government organizations who will accept nothing short of genuine democratic transformation. They've waited too long. They've buried too many relatives who died waiting. For them, any deal that leaves the Cuban system partially intact is a betrayal of everyone who suffered under it. And on the other side, you have a Cuban government that views every concession as a potential crack in the dam. They've watched what happened to leaders who made deals with Washington. They've seen what happened to Gaddafi, to Saddam, to Maduro. The lesson those examples teach is not reassuring. So Rubio is standing in the middle of two groups, both of whom have deeply legitimate grievances, both of whom have reasons rooted in real history to distrust the other side. And he's trying to find an arrangement that neither fully satisfies, but both can live with. That is diplomacy at its most brutal and most human. And here's the thing that makes Rubio uniquely positioned for it, and simultaneously uniquely dangerous to the process. He has credibility with the Cuban-American community that no other figure in Washington possesses. When he says a deal is acceptable, people in Miami who would reject that same deal from anyone else might actually listen. That credibility is real. It was earned over decades. It's not transferable. But that same credibility creates pressure. Because if Rubio signs off on something that the hardliners in the diaspora community decide is insufficient, if they feel he sold them out, that he compromised the cause for political convenience, the backlash would be severe, personal, career-defining in the worst way. So he's navigating not just a geopolitical negotiation, but a deeply intimate political tightrope. And underneath all of it, underneath the strategy and the law and the oil blockade and the diplomatic delegations, there is a question that nobody can fully answer yet. Even if everything works, even if a deal is reached, even if Diaz-Canel steps aside and some reform-oriented figure takes the wheel, even if the embargo is partially lifted and American investment begins to flow into the island, what does Cuba actually become? Because here's what 67 years of communist rule have done, and this is not a political judgment. It's just an observation about institutional reality. There is almost no one within the Cuban system who has experience running anything in a market economy. No one with a track record of managing private enterprise, of attracting foreign investment, of building the kind of transparent institutional framework that economic development requires. The doctors are exceptional. The soldiers are trained. The state bureaucracy is vast. But the reformers? The people who could actually implement a genuine economic opening? They left. Most of them are in Miami, or Madrid, or Caracas, or Houston. The human capital that Cuba needs to rebuild is, largely, outside Cuba. And that is perhaps the deepest problem of all. Because even if the political transition happens, even if the right deal is struck and the right people are installed and the embargo comes down, the country still faces the enormous task of rebuilding an economy that has been distorted by 6 decades of central planning, isolation, and mismanagement. That's not a 6-month project. That's not even a 6-year project. And the Cuban people, the ones standing in those fuel lines, the ones whose children are missing school, the ones who've already watched 2 million of their neighbors leave, they are not in a position to wait another decade for a promise to materialize. They've heard promises before. What they want is simple. The same thing people everywhere want. To live a normal life. To feed their families. To have the lights come on in the evening. To not have to choose between medicine and food. And right now, regardless of what Trump wants, regardless of what Rubio is negotiating, regardless of what the Pentagon is planning, those basics are slipping further out of reach. Every day that passes without fuel is another day the system frays a little more. Every canceled surgery, every school closure, every garbage truck sitting idle. These aren't just statistics. They're the texture of a society coming apart at the seams. And somewhere in Havana, the men who have run this country for decades are watching the same numbers. They know what the oil levels are. They know what the reserve supplies look like. They know how many days are left before the next crisis hits. The question they're asking themselves every morning isn't ideological anymore. It's existential. How do we survive this? There's a moment in every prolonged crisis when the abstract becomes concrete. When the numbers stop being numbers and start being people. Cuba passed that moment a while ago. What's happening on that island right now isn't a political story anymore. Or at least, it's not only a political story. It's something more immediate than that. More human. The kind of thing that doesn't fit neatly into geopolitical analysis because it's happening in kitchens and hospital wards and school hallways and gas station lines that stretch for hours in the heat. Let me paint the picture for you. Cuba needs roughly 100,000 barrels of oil per day to keep its civil society functioning. Hospitals running, schools open, garbage collected, water pumped. The basic infrastructure that holds a society together, all of it requires fuel. Cuba produces about 40,000 barrels on its own. The other 60,000, the difference between functioning and failing, has always come from outside. For 30 years, that outside came from Venezuela. Before that, the Soviet Union. And when those relationships weakened, Cuba improvised. Smaller shipments from Mexico, Algeria, Angola, Russia, Brazil. A patchwork of suppliers keeping the lights on. That patchwork is now gone. Trump's executive order, signed in January 2026, didn't just tighten sanctions on Cuba directly. It did something more surgical. It threatened 30% tariffs on any country that continues to supply oil to the island. That's not a punishment for Cuba. That's a punishment for anyone who helps Cuba. It transformed the oil supply chain from a political inconvenience into a financial liability for every country involved. And it worked. One by one, the tankers turned around. The suppliers stopped calling. Mexico sent one shipment in January. 85,000 barrels. Russia delivered 100,000 barrels at the end of March. And beyond that, almost nothing. That's not an embargo anymore. that's a blockade in everything but name, and the consequences are not abstract. Power outages that used to last a few hours now last most of the day in some parts of the country. The national grid, already fragile from years of deferred maintenance and fuel shortages, is operating at a fraction of its capacity. In some provinces, people are going 12, 14, 16 hours without electricity. Think about what that means practically. Food spoils, medical equipment fails, the pumps that move water through pipes stop working. And in the Caribbean heat, without refrigeration, without fans, without the basic relief that electricity provides, daily life becomes genuinely punishing. Hospitals are canceling elective surgeries, not because they lack doctors or equipment. Cuba has actually invested significantly in medical training over the decades, and its doctors are genuinely skilled. But without reliable power, without the fuel to run generators, surgical theaters become dangerous. You don't operate on someone when you can't guarantee the lights stay on. Schools are suspending classes, not as a political decision, as a practical one. There's no fuel to run the buses, and without transportation, children in rural areas simply can't get there. Garbage is piling up on the streets because the trucks don't have diesel to run their routes. In a tropical climate, that's not just unpleasant. It's a public health crisis waiting to happen. Mosquito-borne diseases, dengue, chikungunya, Zika, spread faster in conditions like these. And the public health system, already overwhelmed, has fewer resources to respond. This is what maximum pressure looks like from the inside. Not a dramatic military confrontation, not missiles or gunships. Just the slow, grinding withdrawal of the energy that modern society requires to function. And yet, and this is the part that demands honesty, the regime is still standing. That's the paradox that has frustrated American policymakers for decades, and it remains frustratingly relevant right now. The Cuban government has an extraordinary capacity to absorb suffering. Not its own suffering, but the suffering of its population. The leadership doesn't stand in the gas lines. The generals don't cancel their surgeries. The people at the top of the system have access to resources that ordinary Cubans don't. That's not unique to Cuba. It's true of authoritarian systems everywhere. The insulation at the top is precisely what makes these regimes so difficult to dislodge through economic pressure alone. You squeeze the population suffers. But the people with the power to change things, the ones whose decisions actually determine the country's direction, they don't feel the squeeze the same way. So the theory of maximum pressure, starve the economy until the government capitulates, has a fundamental flaw built into it. The people who capitulate first are not the ones in power. They're the ones already suffering. And Cuba has a long, painful history of ordinary people suffering while the government endures. The special period in the 90s, the decades of rationing, the waves of emigration, 2 million people left between 2020 and 2025 alone, 18% of the entire population. Think about that number for a moment. Nearly 1 in 5 Cubans has left in the last 5 years. That's not migration. That's hemorrhaging. And the people who leave are disproportionately the young, the educated, the entrepreneurial, the ones who might otherwise build something different. Every time someone gets on a raft or boards a plane to Havana's airport with a one-way ticket, the pool of people who could lead a transition shrinks a little more. Which brings us back to the central dilemma of this entire situation. The United States, and Trump specifically, wants change in Cuba. Real change. Not cosmetic adjustments, not the release of 2,000 political prisoners as a goodwill gesture while the underlying system remains intact. Real structural transformation. But the mechanisms available to produce that change, economic pressure, diplomatic demands, the implicit threat of military action, all have the same limitation. They can destabilize, they can weaken, they can push the Cuban government toward concessions at the margins. What they cannot do, at least not easily, not cleanly, is build what comes after. And that question, what comes after, is the one that haunts every serious conversation about Cuba in Washington right now. Because the Cuban opposition, such as it is fragmented. It exists partly inside Cuba, brave, isolated individuals, and small groups who risk imprisonment for speaking out, and partly in the diaspora, primarily in Miami. But it doesn't have the organizational coherence or the institutional depth to step into a power vacuum on short notice. If the Cuban government collapses tomorrow, genuinely collapses, not a managed transition, but a sudden implosion, there is no alternative government ready to take the wheel. There's no equivalent of a solidarity movement, no underground parliament, no shadow administration waiting to emerge. There's just the chaos that follows when a state fails. And the history of US-backed interventions in the region and beyond offers very little comfort about what that chaos looks like and how long it lasts. Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction, but it had a functioning state. And when that state was dismantled, the aftermath cost hundreds of thousands of lives and more than 2 decades of instability that the region is still living with. Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. The people in Washington who are drawing up military options know this. The serious ones, anyway. They know that a quick raid to capture Diaz-Canel or an air campaign targeting military installations might satisfy a short-term political narrative. But it doesn't answer the morning after question. Who governs? Who maintains order? Who keeps the hospitals running and the water flowing and the streets from descending into violence? These are not rhetorical questions. They are operational ones. And right now, there are no clean answers. What there is, what there's always been with Cuba, is the weight of history pressing down on every decision. The Bay of Pigs, the missile crisis, the Mariel boat lift, the Elian Gonzalez case, decade after decade of conflict and negotiation and failure and hope and more failure. Every American president has eventually had to make peace with the fact that Cuba is harder than it looks from the outside. And Donald Trump, a man who does not by temperament make peace with difficult problems, is now staring at that same wall. With one difference. The wall is cracking. Not because American policy finally found the right lever, but because Cuba itself, the system, the economy, the population's capacity to absorb more pain, is running out of time in a way it genuinely hasn't before. The question isn't whether something changes. Something is going to change. The question is whether the people making decisions in Washington and Havana are capable of shaping what that change looks like, or whether they'll let it happen to them violently and without a plan. History doesn't wait for people to feel ready. It just moves. There's a phrase that gets used a lot in foreign policy circles. The window of opportunity. It sounds clinical, detached, like something you'd read in a think tank report written by someone who's never stood in a gas line in the Caribbean heat. But the phrase is real. And right now, in Washington, there are people who believe, genuinely believe, that the window for resolving the Cuba question is open for the first time in 67 years. Not cracked, not slightly ajar. Open. And the reason isn't any single policy decision. It's not the oil blockade alone, or the fall of Venezuela, or the tariff threats. It's the convergence. The moment when multiple forces, historical, political, economic, personal, all arrive at the same point at the same time. These moments are rare, and they don't last. Let's map the convergence clearly, because it's worth understanding precisely why this moment feels different from every other moment in the long, exhausting history of American-Cuban relations. First, Cuba's external lifelines are gone in a way they've never been simultaneously gone before. Venezuela, the country that kept Cuba alive after the Soviet collapse, is no longer in a position to help. Its leader was removed in January. The replacement government, dependent on Washington's goodwill for its own survival, is not going to antagonize the United States by shipping oil to Havana. Russia is dealing with its own economic constraints, its own diplomatic isolation, its own calculations about what Cuba is worth, versus the cost of provoking a direct confrontation with Washington in the Western Hemisphere. The 100,000-barrel shipment it sent in March was a gesture, a signal that it hasn't abandoned Havana entirely. But it's not the sustained, reliable supply that Cuba needs. China, the country that many analysts assumed would step into the vacuum, has been quieter than expected. Beijing has its own reasons for caution. It's in the middle of complex trade negotiations with Washington. It's watching how the United States handles Cuba and drawing conclusions about how it might handle Taiwan. It's not going to sacrifice its broader strategic interests for the sake of Havana. So Cuba is genuinely isolated in a way it hasn't been since the early years of the revolution. Before the Soviet embrace, before the Venezuelan lifeline, before the patchwork of alternative suppliers. Second, the internal situation in Cuba has reached a threshold. The protests of 2021, the largest anti-government demonstrations in decades, were a warning signal. They were suppressed, brutally. Thousands were arrested. But they revealed something important. The social contract between the Cuban government and its population, already strained for years, was tearing. That tear has only widened since. 2 million people leaving in 5 years is not a population that has made its peace with the situation. It's a population that is voting with its feet in the most literal way possible. And the ones who remain, the ones who couldn't leave or chose not to or are waiting, are living through conditions that keep deteriorating. There is a limit to how much a society can absorb. Cuba has absorbed extraordinary amounts. But limits are real. Third, and this is the piece that often gets underweighted in the analysis, the political moment in the United States is uniquely aligned. You have a president who wants a visible foreign policy victory and is not constrained by the diplomatic traditions that slowed his predecessors. Trump moves on instinct and on opportunity. When he sees an opening, he moves toward it without the institutional hesitation that characterizes more conventional administrations. You have a Secretary of State whose personal investment in the Cuba issue goes beyond politics. It's biographical. Rubio isn't going to let this moment pass without exhausting every option. This is the cause he built his career around. This is the thing his parents talked about at the kitchen table. And you have a midterm election in November that creates a very specific timeline. Not years, months. These three things, Cuba's vulnerability, Cuba's isolation, and the American political calendar, are all pointing at the same window at the same time. That's the convergence. Now, given all of that, what are the actual options on the table? Because this is where it gets genuinely complicated and genuinely dangerous. The diplomatic track is real. The State Department delegation that flew to Havana in April was not a symbolic gesture. It was a working visit. The Americans brought demands. The Cubans listened. The fact that the meeting happened at all, that a U.S. government aircraft landed in Cuba for the first time in years, signals that both sides are at least exploring what a deal might look like. Cuba has already made some gestures in that direction. The 2,000 political prisoners released in April. The new regulations allowing diaspora Cubans to own businesses on the island. These aren't nothing. They're signals that Havana is willing to move, up to a point. The question is where that point is. Because the gap between what the United States is demanding and what the Cuban government is willing to concede is enormous. Compensation claims of $9 to $10 billion from a country whose economy is in free fall. Free elections from a government whose entire identity is built on the rejection of that model. The dismantling of state security from a regime that has used its security apparatus as the primary mechanism of political control for 6 decades. These aren't negotiating positions that can be split down the middle. They're existential demands, and the Cuban leadership knows that meeting them fully means the end of the system, and quite possibly the end of their personal freedom, given the crimes that full transparency would expose. So diplomacy has a ceiling, a real one. And that ceiling is why the Pentagon is simultaneously drawing up military options. Not because war is imminent, not because the decision has been made, but because, and this is the part that serious analysts in both Washington and Havana understand, the credibility of the diplomatic pressure depends entirely on the military threat being real. The Cubans are not naive. They've been negotiating with Americans in one form or another for decades. They know how to wait. They know how to talk endlessly while changing nothing. Their entire diplomatic tradition is built on patience and endurance. The only thing that changes that calculus, the only thing that makes the Cuban leadership actually move, is the genuine belief that the alternative to a deal is something worse than the deal itself. That's not a theory. It's what the history shows. Cuba made concessions in the 90s, the limited economic reforms under the special period, because the alternative was complete societal collapse. Cuba released political prisoners in April, because the alternative was continued isolation and the risk of something more drastic. Pressure produces movement. The question is whether the right amount of pressure applied in the right way can produce enough movement to matter, without tipping over into the kind of instability that produces chaos instead of transition. That's the line the Pentagon is trying to walk. That's the line Rubio is trying to walk, and it's razor thin. The military options being discussed range across a wide spectrum. At the lower end, increased surveillance flights around the island, naval exercises in the Caribbean, a visible demonstration of force designed to communicate seriousness without triggering a direct response. Further up the spectrum, targeted operations. A raid to capture or neutralize senior officials, airstrikes against military infrastructure, the kind of precise, limited intervention that is designed to decapitate a command structure without committing to a full occupation. And at the far end, an invasion, a genuine ground operation to remove the Cuban government and install something different. That last option is, by almost universal consensus among serious analysts, off the table. Not because it's militarily impossible. Cuba's armed forces, while capable and battle-hardened in spirit, could not realistically hold off a sustained American military assault. But because the aftermath is exactly what I described earlier. There is no government in waiting. There is no institutional infrastructure ready to step in. An invasion of Cuba would be, in the most optimistic scenario, a multi-year occupation with no clear endpoint and enormous costs. Human, financial, and political. And Trump, whatever his rhetoric, is not a president who wants to own a multi-year occupation 90 miles from Florida. So the real game, the actual strategy, beneath all the noise, is using the credible threat of military action to force a negotiated outcome that produces enough visible change to satisfy the domestic political requirements without committing to the full transformation that the legal framework actually demands. It's a strategy built on leverage, on the gap between what you're threatening and what you're actually willing to do. And it requires something that is, frankly, in short supply in this situation. Precision. Precision in the demands. Precision in the threats. Precision in reading how far the Cuban government can be pushed before it stops negotiating and starts making different calculations about its own survival. Because there's a point, and this is the risk that keeps serious people up at night. There's a point at which a cornered government stops trying to survive through accommodation and starts trying to survive through escalation. Cuba still has options in that direction. Not military ones. It can't fight the United States directly. But it has the capacity to create regional instability, to accelerate emigration flows toward Florida in a way that creates a humanitarian and political crisis for Washington, to reach out to whatever external actors are still willing to listen and invite a different kind of engagement. None of these are good outcomes for anyone. Not for the Cuban people, not for the United States, not for the region. But a desperate government doesn't always make rational calculations, and that's the danger that sits underneath everything else. The convergence that makes this moment an opportunity is the same convergence that makes it genuinely volatile. High pressure, narrow margins, personal stakes on multiple sides, a population at its limit, a government cornered but not yet broken, a superpower with an election on the calendar, and a Secretary of State with a personal score to settle. These are the ingredients of something significant. Whether that something is a breakthrough or a disaster, that depends on decisions that haven't been made yet. In rooms we're not in, by people who are carrying more than they're showing. History is being made, quietly, slowly, and then, probably, all at once. The only question left, and it's the most important one, is what it means for the people who have no say in any of it. The ones standing in line for gas in the Havana heat. The ones who watch their kids miss another day of school. The ones who buried someone who didn't have to die if the hospital had power that day. They're not waiting for a geopolitical analysis. They're just waiting for something to change. If you've made it this far in the video with me, and I mean truly with me, not just with the video running in the background while you fold laundry, then I want to take a second to acknowledge something. This isn't easy material to sit with. It's not supposed to be. If you're the kind of person who watches a video like this all the way through, who actually wants to understand what's happening in the world, not just consume the headline and move on, then this channel was made for you. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, because we do this every week. We go deep on the stories that matter, the ones underneath the noise. And before I move on, I want to ask you something. What do you think happens next with Cuba, with Trump, with the 67 years of history we've been unpacking? Leave a comment. A real one, not just a reaction, a thought. Because the people watching this video are the kind of people whose thoughts are worth reading. Now, back to Cuba, because we've spent 6 blocks building towards something, and it's time to say it directly. Here's what I think gets lost in almost every conversation about Cuba. Whether it's happening in a Washington policy meeting or a cable news segment or a Miami kitchen table. The conversation is almost always about governments. What the Cuban government will accept, what the American government will demand, what the legal framework allows, what the political calendar requires, what the military options look like, what the diaspora community will tolerate. Governments, systems, structures, laws, and underneath all of that, almost never mentioned, almost never centered, are about 11 million people who did not choose any of this. They didn't choose to be born 90 miles from the most powerful country in the world. They didn't choose the revolution. They didn't choose the embargo. They didn't choose the special period or the fuel shortages or the 2 million person exodus of their neighbors and relatives over the last 5 years. They just woke up every day in the country they were born in and tried to live their lives inside conditions they had almost no power to change. And right now, today, those 11 million people are caught in the middle of something that is moving faster than at any point in their lifetimes. And they have less control over the outcome than ever. Think about what that feels like. You're a nurse in Havana. You went to school for years. You chose medicine because you wanted to help people. But the regime caps your salary at the equivalent of a few dollars a month, because that's what the system allows. So you fix cars on weekends. You do what you have to do. You get by. And now the lights are going out for 16 hours at a time. And the hospital where you work is canceling surgeries. And the medicine you need to treat your patients isn't arriving. And somewhere across 90 miles of water, a president is talking about a friendly takeover. And a Secretary of State is carrying decades of personal grievance into a negotiating room. And nobody in that conversation is primarily asking what you need. That tension is not unique to Cuba. It's the permanent condition of people who live inside geopolitically significant countries. Their lives become the arena in which larger forces compete. Their suffering becomes the leverage. Their endurance becomes the proof of concept for whatever theory Washington is currently testing. It has happened to them before. It is happening to them now. And it will keep happening, regardless of how the current standoff resolves. Because the structural dynamics that produce this situation haven't changed. A powerful country, a small island, a 90-mile gap, and 67 years of accumulated grievance on every side. Here's what the diplomatic track, if it works, actually produces in the best-case scenario. Trump gets a deal, some version of it. Diaz-Canel steps aside. A more cooperative figure takes the presidency. Cuba opens to some degree of American investment, particularly in tourism. Some of the sanctions are relaxed. The oil starts flowing again, enough to stabilize the power grid, reopen the schools, get the hospitals running properly. Cuban Americans in South Florida see something they can call a win. Not everything they wanted, not the full democratic transformation they've dreamed of for decades. But something. A visible change. A symbolic end to something that has been frozen since before most of them were born. Trump gets his political narrative. Rubio gets his legacy moment. The midterms happen. Life goes on. And in Cuba, life gets marginally better. For a while, the immediate humanitarian crisis eases. The power comes on more reliably. The gas lines shorten. But the underlying architecture, Guayesa and the military that controls it, Raúl Castro and the loyalty networks he commands, the institutional reflexes of a system that has spent 6 decades suppressing dissent and resisting change. That architecture doesn't disappear because of a deal. It adapts, the way it has always adapted. And within a few years, you're back to a version of the same conversation. Slightly different actors, slightly different leverage points, but the same fundamental dynamic. Because the thing about managed transitions is that they manage the transition, not the destination. You can engineer a softer landing. You cannot engineer a functioning democracy from the outside. You cannot install civic culture. You cannot transfer institutional trust. Those things grow slowly, organically, from conditions that are created by the people who live inside them, not imposed by agreements signed in Washington or Havana. This is the lesson that American foreign policy has learned, or failed to learn, repeatedly, across decades and continents. Change that lasts has to be owned by the people it affects, not delivered to them, not imposed on them, not negotiated on their behalf by parties whose primary interest is their own political survival. Owned by them. And the Cuban people, the ones who have endured the most, sacrificed the most, waited the longest, deserve that. They deserve a future that they actually shape. Not one that's handed to them by Washington and called liberation. Not one that's managed by Havana and called stability. Something genuine. Whether this moment delivers that. Whether the convergence of pressures and personalities and political calendars produces something that actually serves the people standing in those gas lines. That's the question. And the honest answer is probably not fully, not immediately, not cleanly. History doesn't work that way. What it might produce, what this moment has the potential to produce, if the decisions are made carefully and the people involved rise above their narrowest interests, is a crack, a genuine opening, the beginning of something that hasn't been possible for 6 decades. Not an ending, a beginning. And sometimes, when you've been waiting this long, a beginning is enough to hold on to. There's a photograph I keep thinking about. You've probably never seen it. Most people haven't. It's not famous. It doesn't have a caption that changed history or a moment that everyone remembers. It's just a street in Havana. Late afternoon light. A man sitting on the steps of a building that used to be something. You can tell by the architecture, by the bones of the place. But is now just weathered and waiting. He's not doing anything dramatic. He's just sitting, watching the street, the way people sit when they've learned that time moves differently than they were promised it would. There are millions of versions of that photograph, taken in different countries, different decades, different crises. The faces change, the street changes, the particular disaster that produced the stillness changes. But the stillness is always the same. It's the stillness of people who have been waiting so long that waiting has become its own kind of life. Cuba has been that photograph for 67 years. And what we've been unpacking in this video, the oil blockade, the diplomatic demands, the Pentagon options, the political calendars, the personal histories of the men making decisions. All of it is, at its core, a story about whether that stillness finally breaks. Not because America decided it was time. Not because Trump wanted a win, or Rubio needed a legacy, or Cuban Americans in South Florida had waited long enough. But because the island itself, the people on it, the system holding it together, the forces converging around it, has reached a point where the stillness can no longer hold. Something is going to move. I want to leave you with something that doesn't resolve cleanly, because the honest version of this story doesn't resolve cleanly. We have spent this video building a detailed picture of what's happening, historically, politically, strategically. And all of that matters. Context matters. Understanding how we got here matters. But there's a level beneath all of it that the analysis doesn't fully reach. It's the level where a mother in Santiago is deciding whether to use the last of her cooking gas tonight or save it for tomorrow. Where a doctor in Havana is looking at a patient who needs surgery and doing math that no doctor should have to do. Where a young man who grew up dreaming of something different is standing at a border or a shoreline, doing the same calculation that 2 million of his countrymen have already done. Stay or go, hope or leave. Believe that this time is different, or accept that it isn't. That calculation, the most intimate one, is happening right now. Across the island, in apartments with no power, in kitchens with almost nothing in them, in conversations that happen quietly, in low voices, because even now, even at this point, the system is still listening. And what I want you to hold on to, if you hold on to anything from this video, is that those people are not a backdrop to the geopolitical story. They are the story. Every sanction has a face. Every oil tanker that turns around has a consequence that lands on someone specific, in a specific kitchen, on a specific day. Every diplomatic demand made in an air-conditioned room in Washington gets paid for, in one way or another, by people who had no seat at the table where it was made. This is not an argument against pressure. It's not a defense of the Cuban government, which has made choices that have produced genuine suffering and should be held accountable for them. It's just a reminder that the cost of this, all of it, whatever happens next, is being paid by people who deserve better than to be leverage. Trump is going to make a decision about Cuba. Maybe he already has, and we just don't know it yet. It might be a deal. It might be an escalation. It might be something in between. A managed ambiguity that keeps everyone unsatisfied but prevents the worst outcomes. Rubio will be in the room when it happens, carrying his parents' story, carrying 67 years of diaspora grief, carrying the weight of a community that has given him everything and expects something specific in return. The Cuban government will be in the room too, carrying their own weight, their own calculations about survival and legacy and what they're willing to sacrifice to stay in power another decade. And the 11 million people on the island will be somewhere else entirely, waiting the way they have always waited. Here's the thing about these moments in history, the real ones, the ones that actually change something. They rarely feel significant when they're happening. The Bay of Pigs felt like a disaster. It was, but it also set the terms for everything that came after. The missile crisis felt like the edge of annihilation. It was, but it also produced, eventually, a channel of communication that prevented something worse. Every turning point in the Cuba story looked, from the inside, like just another chapter in an endless, exhausting conflict. Maybe this moment is the same. Another chapter, another round of pressure and negotiation and partial concessions and frustration and the slow grinding forward of something that refuses to resolve. Or maybe it's different. Maybe the convergence of forces, the stripped lifelines, the crumbling economy, the political alignment in Washington, the personal stakes on both sides. Maybe it adds up to something that actually moves. Not a clean ending. There are no clean endings in stories this old, but a turn, a genuine one. The kind that 10 years from now, people point back to and say, that was when it changed. That was when the long, terrible stillness finally broke. I don't know which version this is. Nobody does yet. But I know this. The decisions being made right now, in Washington and Havana and Miami, in rooms we're not in, by people caring more than they're showing. Those decisions will echo for a long time. And the people they echo loudest for are the ones sitting on the steps of weathered buildings in the late afternoon light, waiting, still waiting, but maybe for the first time in a long time, waiting with a reason to think the wait might end.